Okay. Okay.
All right, we're live.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. So this is a special meeting Police Accountability Board tonight. It is Thursday, and ordinarily we would have our board meetings tonight. We discuss board business, but this is a special meeting. We're actually be talking about our disciplinary matrix and really just having a generalized discussion about this is the very first of its kind, and so we're super excited. But just to talk about some general ideas and where we were going to go next, as far as like talking about disciplinary matrix and just ideas about what we're going to do first. So really excited to get started. And then I'm going to go ahead and give it to the executive director to go ahead and start that.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. So last time the board met, they decided to have a meeting to talk about big picture items about creating this disciplinary matrix. The thought was that the board needed to have some discussions about what the board really wanted to have out of a potential disciplinary process, what kind of justice folks wanted to achieve through something like a disciplinary matrix. Have a chance to talk about disciplinary matrix in general, have a conversation about what this thing could be, where we could go with it, answer those big picture questions. And I know some board members wanted to have some space to deliberate. And so this is that space to talk about big picture items and then maybe talk about, what happens next. I know the board discussed, thinking about breakout teams in terms of, having some people maybe work on some community engagement work around getting community input in this process, maybe having some people break out and do some substantive work, maybe with the staff and our amazing consultants at SMK to learn more about disciplinary matrices and what ours might look like, the nitty gritty. And so, I figured that just to open up the floor, maybe first on those big picture questions. And I know that some of those questions last meeting were about things like, what kind of justice the board wanted to hope to have through any potential disciplinary recommendation or disciplinary process here. So I don't know, Chair Wilson or anyone else who wants to maybe take the floor.
No, I know that you sent an email to the group earlier, which I sent a message hoping that everybody got a chance to look at. I'm really just talking about different types of justice. And so I think I'd just like to start there.
Sure.
I'm looking for the email myself. Give me a second, please.
Oh, okay.
And I'll just start too and this is where our consultants maybe can help by saying I raised the issue because the disciplinary matrices I had seen were basically punitive, right? That they were, I hadn't seen any that had restorative transformative models built into them. They may exist, I just hadn't seen them. So I was just curious that if there were other sort of models in terms of police accountability for disciplinary matrices.
Why don't we let him, Oh, there she is. Okay.
Hi, Rabbi. Yes, actually, you can incorporate restorative justice practices. Some disciplinary matrices also have mediation as part of the matrix. So depending on what the board would like to do in terms of moving away from punitive stances to more restorative justice stances or mediation stances, that can certainly be done. It's been done in other jurisdictions.
I don't want to get in the weeds about this until people have had a chance to sort of talk more philosophically, but later I'll have maybe some more specific questions about that.
Well, while we're waiting, and I know that Rabbi Settle didn't want to continue to pursue this, but my question to you, Mina, is how effective have has it been to use some of the other restorative things? Has does it look like something that is a possibility? Or will we just be wasting our time?
That's a
Restoring.
great question. I think that, for example, with respect to the New York City disciplinary matrix, part of what they do is mediation. So it comes from a mediation standpoint. I can tell you, in terms of my experience having worked with restorative justice outside of the police accountability context, but with offenders, particularly juvenile offenders and police officers, it has definitely been a positive experience for both the police officer as well as the offender, particularly in the cases that I've seen when I was Deputy Attorney General in Washington, D.C. There were a number of cases where there were police officers as well as juvenile offenders. And again, in restorative justice practices, both parties have to agree to the restorative justice measures. So it's not something that either party is being forced into. And the ones that I've witnessed with well-trained restorative justice facilitators and coordinators have been exceptionally positive.
And is it a possibility of having a combination of both? You know, some punitive and then some restorative, so it's not all in one?
I haven't seen one. When you say punitive, are you talking about, say, suspension or loss of vacation days, things of that nature? A letter of reprimand?
I was thinking something more further than a letter of reprimand. It seems now that the letter goes in the police officer's file and they're given 2 weeks off with pay, which doesn't, to an outsider, seem to be particularly punitive. If you're just getting some time off, you know, you need well-needed rest, but still have not worked to change your mind or your attitude or, you know, figuring the next time, so I get another 2 weeks, and
Right. So I think in terms of the disciplinary matrix, when you have a situation like that, there can be progressive discipline, right? So you can talk about maybe initially training or counseling. A counseling session is appropriate, and it moves up along the lines of progression in terms of the discipline to a letter of reprimand, suspension without pay or suspension with pay, a reduction in rank, termination. I've also seen there have been situations where there's an option for forced retirement or resignation with benefits. So I think it depends on a case-by-case situation and really what is appropriate for the facts of that in that particular circumstance, as well as what's appropriate and what the people of Rochester and the board think is appropriate in terms of a sanction.
thank you very much. That was very helpful.
I just have a question for Mina. What are your experiences with the New York City Review Board? What were some of the practices that you all used as far as restorative justice or just justice practices?
So we were a mediation model at the CCRB, and that's what we used. The actual disciplinary matrix that went into effect in New York City went into effect in January of this year, actually. So there's an entire 57-page document that exists for police officers and recommended discipline depending on the circumstances, depending on whether there are aggravating circumstances or mitigating circumstances. But it runs the whole gamut from training, a counseling session, mediation, suspension, and all of the other things that I previously mentioned, reduction in pay, termination being the obviously the highest level of discipline given the situation and the circumstances.
What was the what's the word I want to use? The buy-in, I guess, for lack of a better word, the buy-in of police officers for the restorative justice type of model, or any model that you guys have used. Like, what has been like the convincing factor, I guess.
In terms, so my understanding is that in New York City, they are not using a restorative justice model right now. It's really a mediation model. And with respect to restorative justice, again, both parties have to agree, and the buy-in is from both sides of the equation, the offender and the person who was offended. So that really is the buy-in when you're talking about restorative justice. I imagine if the board, in terms of you, would like to have a restorative justice practice within the PAB, the buy-in certainly would be from the community, from the board itself, from the police department, and probably from the unions.
And wouldn't it be the same for mediation as well? I mean, when both parties need to agree as well?
Yeah, in terms of buy-in?
Mediation.
Right, for mediation practices?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, my understanding is that with the disciplinary matrix in jurisdictions across the country that now exist, there has been buy-in not only from the accountability board itself, but also from the police department and at times the union.
I'm just going to hop in on this. Ida, the Center for Dispute Settlement, which ran the Civilian Review Board, offered mediation as an option. And the way that worked was that the person who filed the complaint and the police officer had to agree to do it. When I was speaking to staff at the center, I was told that that option was rarely used. In some cases, I think there were years where it was never used. And I think, and from what I remember, and I want to check back in with them to get the details on this, because I know this is something we're thinking about. I think what they said was that it was often that community members did not want to do that, if I remember correctly. But what I want to do is get back in touch with them and learn more about how that process did or did not work, specifically around mediation. I think that'll be important for us.
Was it because the community wanted immediate,
Right.
which I think about both of those models, whether it's, mediation or restorative justice, when we think about what we're trying to create here, a partnership with the community, right? The police and the community, and this, better communication, better relationships, better, all those types of things. Like, those models seem to be, most appropriate, because I don't think that it always has to be punitive, especially, depending on the severity of the case. But, I would think that I would want to have some mediation, some, understanding, some conversation, some, mending of whatever may have happened more than anything else. But it'll be interesting to see which parties are willing and which ones are not.
So the other thing I'd say about mediation is that there is, at least among some mediators, a very strong belief that you really shouldn't mediate in cases where there's real unequal power situations. And I certainly could, imagine community people would feel that way, that would be part of the reluctance, right? So, I mean, in that sense, I would be interested in hearing how, that sort of in New York, how that did work, because that would be certainly my hesitation about assuming, mediation would be a central model for how you do that work.
Mina, I was asked a question by Bob in the text. I don't think that he can hear, but he can't speak, I think. Can we have the cake and eat it too? In the sense that can we let the people who've been harmed, the victims, choose between a restorative option and maybe a punitive option? Is that something that's been done in other places? Having the victims, kind of people who've been harmed, say, this is what I really want to have happen?
Again, my experience with that has been in terms of a criminal process versus a restorative justice process, right? And again, it's all in terms of what the community desires and what the board desires in terms of this disciplinary matrix. I've seen scenarios where there was the less punitive approach taken. It actually involved someone who was, the victim was a restorative justice coordinator and wanted to see a restorative justice method approach employed as opposed to the more punitive measures. So I think that probably with the less egregious acts and less egregious misconduct that occurs, that could be an option. And again, it's something that can be worked into the disciplinary matrix. Obviously, always keep in mind that what you want to consider are the mitigating factors as well as the aggravating factors of any given scenario.
I guess, but in terms of the mandate of the board, right, too, though, if it's about changing the behavior, right? So to me, accountability, in other words, for instance, like a lot of punitive processes don't actually include accountability in that they don't follow up on a change in behavior, right? So in other words, sending someone away, whether you're firing them, whether you're putting them on leave, whatever, is not actually holding them accountable because they don't have to demonstrate that their behavior has changed in any way, right? So it seems that we also have sort of a philosophical decision to make, if you will, about how we define accountability and how we understand what it means to hold police officers accountable.
You know what I was thinking of too is what about like internally within police departments about how they deal with issues within the department? Do they have restorative? Do they have mediation? Is it a tiered approach? I'm just also curious about that because if we're talking about people actually feeling comfortable with a certain way of talking to each other, right? Because I think that'd be a great place to at least start, or at least talk about.
I think it varies across the board, Chair Wilson, quite frankly. I think that, again, the most common methods and approaches that police departments normally take are sort of retraining, these counseling sessions, the letters of reprimand. The most egregious conduct, for example, in New York City, the use of the chokehold, right? That can lead to termination. So the most egregious conduct by a police officer is usually saved for the most severe sanctions. And I think by and large, police departments across the country tend to err on the I don't want to say softer side, but tend to err on the less punitive measures when they're dealing with members of their police departments.
I have a question for Ron or Mina. I know that disciplinary matrices are not the only kind of guidelines for consequences, right? There's sentencing guidelines. There's not just in the policing context, but there's school district guidelines for how school districts deal with punishment and suspension. And in those other tools, those frameworks, are there things that are really interesting or notable that are missing from most police disciplinary matrices? Things like, the one thing that comes to my mind is the victim impact statement in the criminal justice system, right? That's something that I haven't necessarily seen in the police disciplinary context. And I'm just wondering if there are other things you might think of as important, maybe like remedies, like, I don't know, community service requirements or something. I just don't know.
It's an interesting question and a good one. I hadn't really thought about what else is out there. These frameworks are certainly good comparators, obviously, because they do the same sort of work. So let me put a little thought to that. There may be some useful nuggets from one of these other regimes that we could sort of import into this system.
I like the idea of also what Dr. Harrison was saying about, letting the citizen decide what they would like to see happen. And I also wondered too, we talked about mediation not really being used, but I wondered too if it's because they just really never saw a positive or the outcome that they desired, right? And if that they actually did see desired outcome, I wonder if that would change. So I wonder if that's something that we should look into.
So with all this, I guess I'd be interested to hear in the different systems, what have you found to be effective? Because I guess for me, again, the purpose of this is not punishment, it's accountability. So can you say that you've been able to see that certain types of approaches are more effective than others in doing this?
That's a great question. I think there are so many variables that go into that answer, Rabbi, quite frankly. Not only a sustainable disciplinary matrix, right, but also having a police department that is willing to hold their members accountable when necessary. I think that a lot of times that the atmosphere and the environment that's created in any given organization or any institution comes from the top. And if the leadership of an organization is willing to hold their members accountable, that is extremely important. And in terms of this disciplinary matrix, it's only as useful as the willingness to apply it, right? Quite frankly. So there are just so many variables to come to consider in that situation. But I think what's the most important is an organization, a police department, where its leadership is willing to hold their members accountable, and an accountability board, a police accountability board or a civilian review board that has the power and the teeth to implement the sanctions in a disciplinary matrix.
I have a question. I just have a follow-up question for Rabbi Settle. Rabbi Settle, I know you're stating you want to holding them accountable, the outcome. It's not about punishment, which I completely agree with. What is something that you would want to change about the specific, a specific officer with an incident? What would the ideal change be?
I think it would depend on the incident, right? But I think,
yeah.
I guess, obviously it depends on what it is, but I guess the concept is that, for me at least, right, thinking about the materials that we had looking, that there's sort of the punitive piece, but even within restorative or transformational, there's the thing about solving the individual problem, if for a minor thing, an apology, for instance, a willingness to say I was wrong, and I shouldn't have done that, and I apologize to you, right? I mean, for some individuals, even that is like a huge thing to be able to sort of say that, right? And it can be very meaningful for somebody. But it also, I would hope that we can also look at a framework about what allows this to happen to begin with. In other words, like we know that in policing culture, certainly a lot of what I've read and heard, is that there are police officers who see the people they're policing as unlike themselves in a variety of ways, right? There are cultural issues that are reflected in those interactions too. So how sort of thinking about how do we then, it's not about that individual officer. Maybe it's also about the training they're getting. Maybe it's about, I mean, this is there are a whole bunch of other things. I also guess I feel like I've said this to the board before, like my son isn't trained as an EMT. And when he did his exams, he had to practice stuff so that it was so reflexive, he didn't even have to think about it. Right. And I want, de-escalation techniques to be so reflective, so instinctive that police officers don't have to think about them. Right. To sort of think about things like that. I want courtesy to be so instinctive that they don't have to think about it. Right. I mean, why are those things not ingrained in that way, in terms of how training happens? So to ask systemic questions in that way too, as well as the individual things, I guess is part of what I'm thinking about. Does that answer your question?
Yes, okay. It definitely answers my question. Thank you for that. The reason I was asking because there's certain situations that officers are in that even if the force, I was just asking, you did answer the question. I'll stop, I digress. Thank you.
Because for me, the job isn't just to repair the harm that already happened. It's to not have more harm happen. Let's not do it again,
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I guess to add to that, for some people, it is to repair the harm that has already been done. Because oftentimes people feel like there is no justice being done, and they do want to see that punitive portion of it to make sure that, justice is served. So I'm in favor definitely of, both components, and and building in some evaluation component to it. I definitely think we'd have to see how that rolls out. But I think something that you mentioned earlier, you talked about, there's no accountability, but I'm just wondering how they're going to be evaluating the process. Like, okay, fine, if Officer 1 has, an interaction with someone and has to have some kind of punitive process, and then the behaviors continue again after they've come from suspension or et cetera, then is the process already going to be built in like that? Or then do we start over from scratch again and they start back with the kind of initial punitive piece? So I guess really just thinking about how that process is going to roll out, and if the evaluation piece is going to be built in there, I guess to serve as the accountability piece.
I think those are great points that you raised, Dr. McIntosh. I think what's important too is not just sort of meting out discipline, but keeping track of the disciplinary measures that are given out, right? And that is where the board comes in again as an organization, as an agency, is to keep track of that data and which officers have committed which misconduct and what measures were taken to correct that misconduct, to hold them accountable, or what sanctions were imposed. And over time, certainly I hope that there's some historical, some history for the RPD officers now in terms of who has committed misconduct and how they were held accountable. And over time, you can track that. You can track the measurements, and you can track the metrics of which officers are committing harm, how they're being dealt with and held accountable, and what is working on which officers and when it's not working. And I think once you identify the number of officers where the disciplinary matrix is not working, then that's when you can move to the progressive discipline. And that's when you can take or recommend stricter measures in terms of dealing with those officers.
I guess I don't see any hands up. So I guess I'm just wondering, with what you just said, this whole idea that 50A was supposed to kind of give the public a bird's eye view into this disciplinary thing. With this disciplinary matrix, I assume that much of this will be a public process. And how will that information be housed so people in the public could get access to that information? Because we see that 50A kind of people weren't getting access to these different disciplinary charts or, the officers' records. So how would this roll out in terms of, this being public knowledge? Would they be able to have access to something like this? How would this be documented for the public? Can you speak to that? I don't even know if that makes sense, but I'm just wondering because there's just so much difficulty around the other documents.
Sure. So in jurisdictions across the country, there are disciplinary matrices that are actually public and can be accessed by the public. In terms of the abolishment of 50A and keeping that data with respect to police departments in New York State, you can again track that data and track what misconduct has been done by certain officers and how that misconduct has been addressed in terms of sanctions. So that is something that you would need a database as the Police Accountability Board. You would need a database to create that so that you can keep track of it. When I was executive director of the Civilian Complaint Review Board, 50A still was in effect, but we created an open data portal where you can go and you could see the entire city of New York and all the precincts in New York City. You could tell which precincts had the highest number of use of force incidents, and you could track it by use of force, abuse of authority, discourtesy, offensive language, and see how many officers were committing those types of misconduct across the city and in which precincts. So it's something that you would need a data scientist to collect and to create for the Police Accountability Board.
I just want to piggyback on that before Reverend Nikoloff speaks. PAB is hiring data people to do stuff like this. And I'll just give you an example of what has happened in a place like Chicago, where not only can you have a database to see all the disciplinary actions against officers, there's a heat map where you can see where incidents are happening, right? Where complaints are coming from, what kind of people are filing them, all this kind of stuff. And why PAB is doing a lot of thinking about this. We are getting a case management system, right? And that case management system is going to be the hub of our data collection, right? And we're hoping to plug in the city's existing disciplinary records into that system, and then having that system plug into rockpab.org so that people can easily access and look up disciplinary records, not only what the PAB is doing, and seeing the outcomes of our investigations, but also being able to see the broader disciplinary patterns across the police department. That's something we really, really want to make sure happens, and we're putting together the contracts and the staff to hopefully make that happen.
Yeah,
Thank you for that, Connor. Yes, go ahead. I was just about to announce you, Reverend Nikoloff, and then I had Shani.
Again, apologies for showing up late. My computer is having all sorts of issues right now, on top of being initially late. But a question I have following up on we were just discussing, is there any data, has anyone done any kind of, that you're aware of, any of this kind of data collection and or surveying of actual police officers who have undergone discipline, right? I mean, I know you said that it's something that'd be good to know, but even if it's in other departments, not just the side of like what punishments / disciplines have been meted out, but how people have responded to them, how effective they have been. Would it be possible for us to, because we're supposed to also work with the RPD, to do some of a similar surveying of RPD officers in an anonymous way so that people who maybe wouldn't be able to stand up publicly and say, yeah, I'd go for restoration, would have a chance to like mark it on a survey without feeling like retribution. Because again, I know we focus a lot on hearing the voices of people in the community, and that's absolutely vital and important. And also, if we're hoping that officers are going to agree to some of these interventions, especially the more transformative ones, it would be great to know that they also see how much they're into it, and also to have them feel like they were, as a community of police officers, included in that process as well, and not just so I don't know, I'd just be curious, because I think we want maximum buy-in from every angle right on this. And I'd also love to know just more of the fine-grained data of, you know, maybe the unspoken story of how police officers feel about these approaches, or how they have felt about discipline, or how they feel about the discipline that's been given out to other officers, and feeling like whether it's fair, right? And again, who knows whether people would respond to that, but I'd be interested in hearing those stories from officers as well.
Thank you, Matthew. I have Shani.
Yep. So thank you. I think for flow of conversation, folks, let's raise our hands, because I know that there's a lot of people that have a lot of things to say, and I can see that would be that'll get complicated. So I think the thing that I wanted to ask is thank you for bringing up the idea of looking at historical data, because I think that'll be really important when we're building the PAB, because I was really interested in, after discipline has been implemented, how is that tracked, right? And I think a lot of folks have talked about that already, but then 6 months, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months down the road, you know, when they have to look at how the officer specifically is doing, how is that tracked? And then after, like at the initial 1 month, for instance, 1 month after the incident, how is that closed, right? Is there a checklist? Is there something that they look at? So I'm just looking at like actual like paperwork, administrative stuff, all of that. So that's what I would like to see, just like that, like on the ground kind of flow of information with actual paperwork. So I'm just really curious about what that looks like.
Do we have any more questions or any other input?
Well, so I'm sorry. I
Go
guess the
ahead,
classic
Rabbi
question-
Settle.
The classic question, you know, is
You're okay.
we're starting from scratch. We can do anything we want to do. What are your suggestions for how we go about doing it? Right? That's what you're here for, in a sense. So what would be your fantasy matrix?
So great question again, Rabbi Settle. I think really what's important is that the board as members need to come together and discuss the different types of misconduct that can occur, and what types of sanctions, or punitive or restorative or mediation wise, can be implemented, and what makes sense for each of those things. I mean, there are a whole host of things that and you have wide jurisdiction. You have a lot that you can look at, right, going down the road. So this is going to be a great task for you in terms of sitting down and figuring out all the different permutations in terms of misconduct, and aggravating factors versus mitigating factors, and trying to determine what makes sense to the people of Rochester and what makes sense to the Police Accountability Board in terms of holding officers accountable. And we can provide you with sort of a sample of a disciplinary matrix to get you started, if that would be helpful for you, in terms of just, you know, sort of like a sentencing chart, right? I'm a former prosecutor, so I think of things as in a sentencing chart, but something along those lines where you have different types of misconduct and the different types of responses to that misconduct that can be implemented. But I have to say, it is a monumental task that you're taking on. And it's a great one, considering all the types of things and misconduct that you can look at. It's not going to happen overnight. There are going to be so many different iterations that you come up with, and so many different variables that you'll need to consider in coming up with a disciplinary matrix.
Does that answer your question, Rabbi Settle?
Sure. I mean, though I guess again, I mean, do you feel that when you say you can give us an example, I mean, do you feel that there's an example that is what you would say is an ideal example? Or, I mean, because I don't know, but certainly I've looked through things I found on the internet, but I don't know that I found one that does, at least for me, I haven't, and maybe I haven't looked in the right places, but I haven't seen a lot of sort of restorative justice stuff in the matrices I've seen. They've been much more like, in a sense, sentencing guidelines, if you will. So
Right.
How about ideal examples? I think the point Mina was getting at is that the ideal is so highly contingent, depending on the aims and ambitions of a particular community. And one of the things that we've emphasized is that it's not a sort of cookie cutter thing where you just take something and import it into a community, but it's got to be more organic, coming in the other direction. So yeah, we could provide models, but think of them more as data points, as things to start conversations, and then shape and mold and take a little from here and a little from there and put together a really beautiful thing just for this community. So in that sense, there may be more than one sort of ideal matrix.
I'm curious if there's historical data based on the types of misconduct that are most common in the city of Rochester. I think maybe that would be a great starting point in terms of, what are the most common types of misconduct that officers have to face in the Rochester community.
I was just going to say that I think, the first thing we need to look at is how do we obtain that, right? How do we obtain that information? Is that something that's readily available? What would be the willingness of that being shared with us? And I think that would be the driving force to what we decide needs to happen on this matrix. But I think you said something that I think is worth repeating, and that it's really important for the community as well as city council and other people to understand that this is going to take time. We've been pressed on many times on the time, right? That why aren't you doing this and why aren't you doing that? And we've been waiting for this and we've been waiting for that. And I just want to say that again, that this is important work. This is delicate work. We're talking about people, and we can't rush it, right? And so thank you for saying that, Nina, that this is, that this is a lot of work, and that it's going to take time. And I just hope that people hear that and understand that, because if anything, this is one thing we don't want to rush and just, pick something that's not going to benefit the entire community, including the police department.
Absolutely. And I think, what's important to note is that the board is going about this in a very important way, not only communicating with the community at large and getting their input, but you're also going to be, working with the police department in terms of figuring out what the best model and the best approach is, as well as possibly the union. And so those are all things to consider. And when you're talking about the broad jurisdiction that you have in terms of what you can look at, that just expands this disciplinary matrix exponentially.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that, Board Member Perez. That was definitely important. And thank you as well, Mina. I have Connor, and then I don't know if Shani, you had your hand up, or was that just like a wave? Just
I think
a
she
wave.
was supporting what Ida said, giving the hand clap.
I thought it was, but I wanted to make sure.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you, board member, for saying that, because that's super important.
Yes.
So I'm relaying a comment from Bob, who is using me as a figurehead here. It's more important to be simple and to be quick rather than comprehensive. Now, I know there's a lot more to be said on this, Bob, and I don't want to put words in your mouth on this, but I do think this is something that has come up before. Mina, I know that when you look at the rules and regulations for RPD, and then there are 300 specific rules and regulations just in the rules and regulations book. And then there's every single general order and administrative order too that officers can violate. And then you add on all of the state laws, federal laws that we are responsible for investigating violations of. I think this gets to Bob's point about being comprehensive. How can a disciplinary matrix deal with all of these different items? And something that Bob is telling me now is it possible to establish something preliminary and then return and revise it and expand it as we move forward? Not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good.
I think that's definitely a possibility. And I think that's probably why it's a good idea to start in a place where there is historical data about the types of misconduct that is most prevalent in the city of Rochester, committed by the members of the RPD. And it definitely can be a work in progress. Again, obviously you have a wide latitude in terms of what you can look at, the types of offenses and the types of misconduct that you can look at. So something that you create this year or this coming year, it may not fit in 2023 and may be expanded. And it's something that obviously will be expanded given the wide latitude that you have in terms of looking at different types of misconduct. I think what's important to keep in mind, and I like Bob's point about coming up with a preliminary matrix, is coming up with a matrix that addresses all of the concerns that you've brought forth in this conversation tonight. Is how do you deter future misconduct, and making sure that you're imposing appropriate penalties that are fair and proportional and rational to the misconduct that has occurred, and resolving disciplinary matters, impartially and in a prompt and efficient manner. I think that's the goal of the initial preliminary disciplinary matrix.
Go ahead, Board Member Brown, and then Chair Wilson.
Great evening again. Yes, I agree that we need to get started. My next question is, and I've heard you mention a couple of times the data gathered on what are some of the things that the police officers have been accused of and how we assimilate that. Has that information been compiled? Is that where we need to start to see what the issues are here? Or have we already begun? I want to give that to Tom.
I think that's a tough question, Arlene. Ron, are you looking to say something?
Yeah, I can jump in there. It's a tough question because the data is imperfect at best, and that's probably why Connor grimaced a little bit.
And I can explain in detail why. That's the perfect answer,
Okay.
Ron.
Yeah, go ahead.
So two things, Arlene. There is data we can get, right? So there's two sources of data. There are the citizen complaints filed in the city of Rochester, right? And then there's the disciplinary actions taken by the RPD. Now, the issue is that almost nobody's been filing civilian complaints in the city of Rochester, right? In 2020, there were 11 complaints reviewed by the Civilian Review Board, right? 11. In the year of mass protests around policing, there were 11 complaints. Now, there were more complaints filed probably, and we can look at all that. But the question with those complaints is, did anyone code them, or are they just pieces of paper, right? Because if they haven't been coded in any sense, no one's gone through and says, this is a complaint about X, Y, or Z. And, there's numbers on that. So, even if there is the raw data, someone would have to, really process it to get some answers out of it. Now, with the disciplinary items for, seeing the disciplinary records of officers, accusations, all that, that's all in a single database in the Rochester Police Department, right? Now, part of the problem is that there's terms in the union contract that say when officers' records have to be wiped clean. So a lot of the data that you might want is no longer there. Now, that's being said, there is data, and we can absolutely ask for it, and the city's under a legal obligation to give it to us. There's no question about that. But I think the question is, how long would it take to get the data? And then if the data is in this kind of raw, just like, well, here's the list of complaints, we haven't categorized them or broken them up, it's going to be a project to actually do that. And the question is, how long would that project take? So I think, Arlene, one of the answers is looking at what the data is, and if there is quick, easily accessible data that would be useful to us, and then thinking about, well, what is there another data project we need to do, and how long would that take? And the last thing I'll say is that there is data from other police departments on this. And so while you might not get the most relevant data to Rochester, you can look at other jurisdictions and see, well, police departments are often very similar. What's the most common thing? And, you can look at other police accountability boards, go to New York City and see what percentage of those complaints are, about use of force versus officer disrespect. And that might help you too.
Danielle, may I follow up with that? Okay. I understand what you're saying. And if there were only 11 complaints, how hard is that to file and follow up on? And, the year before, if that's the kind of slapdash way things have been kept, you have to work with what we have. And also, I'm under, and could be a misassumption, that there are certain patterns or certain egregiouses that Rochester officers may be, because of the culture here, may be doing or putting forth or displaying. It may not be a big deal in some other place. So I really would like to see what our major complaints are for the officers. I know that disrespect is a big one, but then of course you have to break down what disrespect is. But the use of force, the use of violence, and the mistreating of children here seem to be big areas that I would like for us to look into. And that being said, I'm going to put my hand down, close my mouth.
Thank you, Board Member Brown. If someone has a response, then go right ahead. Then I have Chair Wilson and then Dr. McIntosh.
So just I'm thinking about going back to Dr. Harrison's point about the preliminary matrix, and I completely agree. I think that I just keep thinking about the fact that Rochester changes every year, and that the same Rochester we have today is not going to be the same Rochester we have next year. The problems that we have with the pandemic has drastically changed how the city operates, functions, and what the social problems that we're dealing with, right? Arguably in a micro and a macro level. And then also too that, I don't really necessarily agree that it's going to be a quick thing that we institute, but I do think that the data will make it simple, hopefully. And that I think that, that will help kind of shape what this matrix looks like. But every year this has to be retooled, because just to Board Member Brown's point, where officer disrespect is a thing that a lot of Rochester citizens have frequent complaints on, that will hopefully change over time. But also too, I just wanted to point out to Board Member Brown that the 11 complaints that were received were from the Citizens Review Board, but over the years, there's been hundreds of complaints that have been to the Rochester Police Departments. So there's complaints out there. We're just not really seeing what the actual complaints are, but hopefully we can get that data, right? Thank you.
I think that would be very instrumental. And in analyzing that data, it'll give a great starting point for where the board wants to go with this disciplinary matrix.
Dr. McIntosh and then Connor.
Yeah, I have to wonder if this conversation here just kind of answered it. Yeah, I was just thinking a little bit more about the bystander intimidation and, the different criteria that will be developed, for the matrix and how we're going to include that. But I guess that would kind of fall under the officer harassment. So I'm done speaking.
It's going to channel a Bob Harrison comment here, that we can make our own categories to define what the misconduct is if they haven't already been categorized formally. We can do that. And I just want to agree and say, yes, you could if you were doing the data analysis yourself.
Reverend Nicola.
Yeah, I was also just thinking, and I know this is probably not as much a disciplinary matrix as a culture issue, but it's also, policies and procedures. It would be great if we didn't have to wait till someone breaks the law to work for a restorative relationship between the police and the community. And I wonder if we just keep that in mind going forward as well, that even if we need to start more punitively in order to get the ball rolling, we can also be working on policies, procedures, trainings, and looking at structures that promote restorative practices, and in particular relationship, right? Because one of the ways that I think everyone would acknowledge, like, someone is less likely to commit an act of violation against someone if they know them and have a relationship with them, right? So I do think that there's a lot of that restorative work that needs to be done regardless. And again, not sure if which one of our kind of buckets it falls under. I'm sure it drips into many of them, but I'd like to see us be thinking that way as well, right? Preventative is not just how do we scare people out of not doing the wrong thing, but also how can we kind of encourage and entice people into like the joy of doing the right thing, and the kind of communities we want. So wherever that fits in, I want to make sure just we as a board keep that in mind as well.
Sorry, I didn't know I was on mute. Board Member Brown, did your hand go back up or?
Yes, it did, because I want to agree with Reverend Nikoloff as far as something positive. And again, for me, let's start looking for officer friendly. Let's, along with this, decide what as a community we think the ideal officer interaction officers should look like. And how do we help them get to that model? Who's doing it well? Who do we need to recognize? How do we recognize? Because I think if we hold up good examples of someone that's working with the community, making the community feel safe, others will want to get on the bandwagon. And then once a year, well, maybe even, yes, citizens can nominate various officers to say, this officer did la da 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 da. The board has a big banquet. All of these officers who have been recommended or recognized, we pay for them to come to the banquet. And that night, officer friendly is introduced to the community. This is the ideal. This person is working toward the ideal of what the citizens would like to see an officer be or an officer do. Because as Reverend Nikoloff said, everything can't be punishment. But if we want them to do better, we need to give them a model to work toward.
Any other input? The time check is now 7:37. I think we expected to end this at 8. Shani, Chair Wilson, would you like to sum up some of the themes that you've heard thus far?
Yep. Thank you. So I've written down a couple things. That the first is data analysis is really coming up with common themes that people are interested in finding out more about, and really first starting out with haggling about data, wondering how we can really get a good grasp on what we need, but really around tackling the bigger things first and getting a sense of what RPD is doing about common disciplinary problems with officers and how they're approaching them. And I think just like from top to bottom, like the initial complaint, and then like I would love to see the initial complaint and then take it to the actual end and then actually see how that works. So maybe we can actually add that to that, but that's also falls under data, right? So I would say that the first common things that I'm hearing, and everybody can jump in if they hear any more, is data analysis and then tackling or at least examining common problems first. Executive Director.
Just to channel a Bob piece of input here. The enemy of progress is the perfect first draft. Make it rough and go.
Touche. Touche. Anything other than the 2 points that Chair Wilson just mentioned? Data analysis and the common problems or issues. Reverend Nikolov, am I seeing a head nod? Or?
I'm just agreeing, and I think I do want to just re-echo Arlene, Reverend Brown, Board Member Brown, all of the above. I love that idea of how do we hold up examples, and I think it would be great. Which because of pandemic, and I think because of just all the limitations, we still have we haven't sat down and just kind of had those kind of imaginative and philosophical conversations together. And I think it would be really wonderful, to do some of that creative, proactive work. And I love that idea. How do we help people be the best version of the police officer that I think they signed up to be, the best version of the citizens and the neighbors, and hearing from the community what they think a good police officer has looked like, and give some concrete examples so that we can also hold that up. And then we'll also know, like, okay, clearly here's the standard, but then that also helps us to say, like, look how egregiously, this is why this offense then is more serious, because it's not just breaking the law. It's not just that it's racist. It's also undermining community. It's also undermining all these efforts that we are doing. And I think everyone will want to come together to make sure that we have that kind of culture. So yeah, I love that. And I do think but that comes through the stuff that Shani's talking about, like data analysis, hard work of doing some community organizing, one-on-one conversations, all that kind of stuff. So in some ways it's even harder to build that kind of a, as someone who works in kind of the spiritual business, like it's much harder to build something when you don't just get a clear black and white answer, but it has to be based on relational work. So yeah, in addition to the legal work, we have a lot of community work that I'd love to see us get started on as well as a board and with our partners and allies, because yeah, the people have a lot to teach us still that we haven't learned.
Thank you for that. Let's go with, I think it was Connor first and then Chair Wilson and then Board Member Perez.
A comment from Bob to, I think if this is a suggestion to form a committee on this and then having a meeting date, essentially making sure that we have logistical next steps for after this discussion.
Did you have that? You got that down, Chair Wilson?
Yeah, but I guess I want to point out to Dr. Harrison that I think when we initially thought about having a matrix committee, this was one of the issues that we were tackling, right? Which is why we're all here. So if the suggestion is to make a committee to talk about some of these bigger themes that we can kind of tease out, then that's fine. But I just wanted to make sure that, this is a committee within a committee. And then some of the other things too that I had for common themes were good data. Data in itself, right, to Reverend Nikolov's point, and then like what's working well, and then community input as well. Thanks.
I just wanted to make a quick comment on regards to the upstanding officers. When we started the PAC back on Clinton Avenue, and we actually had an office there. One of the ideas that we had was to have like a community hall of fame for officers that, that we thought were officers that were working well with the community and that had good relationships and that, had good partnerships. So I definitely like that idea because it was something that we had talked about, but then then COVID came and everything died down, and then now the space is used for something else. But I also have to say that I work with a lot of officers in my particular community, and they don't often hear how when they are doing a good job, or when they're, and I can, go story by story of all the things that we've managed to do here with the help of officers. So any opportunity that we as a community have to recognize the work, the good work that they do, it's always welcome, because they don't hear it enough.
I think that's a great idea. And I think that in New York, at times when officers have performed exemplary in their duties, there have been things that citizens have done, right? Which is called, quote unquote, the attaboy letter, right? Basically, where they're writing a letter to their commanding officer of their precinct and explaining the situation that the officer responded to and how that officer appropriately, professionally dealt with that situation with courtesy and respect for all individuals involved. And one situation that particularly comes to mind is when you're dealing with people with mental health issues. So I have a relative who has dementia. And at times, people with dementia, unfortunately, they don't act appropriately. They may get a little violent, and police officers were called to the scene to handle the situation. And I have to say that these two NYPD officers handled the situation so wonderfully, with respect for this elderly relative, and appropriately gave her courtesy, gave her respect, and it didn't have to escalate, right? Even though she in her demented state was trying to escalate the situation, they made sure to de-escalate the situation. And I think that's very important, is to recognize officers when they do appropriate work and they do go above and beyond the call of duty. It's really important to them.
And Ida, one thing I want to say is that, when people often think of a hotline for a PAB or contacting PAB, they think of it as a complaints line. And one thing that I think we've some of us have talked about is the idea of having the idea of communicating with PAB as, see something you don't like, but do you see something you like? Either way, let us know. Either way, let us know so that we can know what's good and what's bad, and then figure out how to push up the good while pushing down the bad. And I just want to say I had a conversation with an officer today about that, and how, that idea of PAB looking for the good too is so reassuring to officers, to think that we aren't out there to, nail people. That's, we're out here to help. And that can be a really big thing for officers.
But it's also a balance. Like, as much as I've tried to say, like, let's make sure we're doing that and the positive stuff, like, bottom line, we're also here to hold police accountable for misconduct. And I think, I do think building trust, all that stuff is part of an overall strategy. So, and it's important for fairness, but like, also, I know something that I often hear, right, is about like places that offer forgiveness right away because something bad happened, like in Charleston, South Carolina, and people are like, you don't have to forgive right away. Like, there's some justice that's needed here, not just kind of nice feelings. And I want to make sure that as we pursue both dimensions, we're also here to like make sure we're listening to the people most adversely affected and with the least amount of power vis-a-vis the system. So, at the end of the day, like, yeah, I love all this stuff a lot, and it feels good to talk about positive stuff, and also to remember, like, we're an accountability board as well.
Well, I just want to say something to that, because to tie both of these things together, since we're talking about a disciplinary matrix and, gathering community data, that's also a part of gathering data, because the community also wants to see that we're looking at discipline, but also looking at officers that are actually doing what they ask, right? That's also part of this story. And so I want to make sure that that's something that we're, like, when we're doing our community outreach, that we're looking forward to, because if we have officers that are overwhelmed with doing certain things, then we can, when we're looking at trends, policies, and practices, we can also examine that as well, right? So it also kind of ties in what we are also already doing.
Anyone else? No. Time check is it's 7:47. Chair Wilson?
So I think, folks, it's 7:47. So I'd really like to get some next steps going forward. I mean, we already have some common themes that we've talked about today that I've mentioned. If there are any that you would like to add, please go ahead and add them to email. I think it's fair to say we can send it to the executive director. I will also put forth Dr. Harrison's idea of establishing committee to kind of work on some of the more overarching common themes. But I think that the committee, we can talk about it through email if you wish, but this is also the committee to work on some of that. But a committee within a committee, I also leave to you all to kind of figure out. Go ahead.
So I think clear next steps for the staff are data.
Mhm.
Making sure we get the data that we can from the city about complaints. Thinking about how to gather data from the community members about maybe what their experiences have been. And I know Natalie Banks has been talking, our Chief of Public Affairs has talked a lot about that. So I think a next step for us would be thinking more concretely about how to get that information. And then other sources of data as well. I know Reverend Nikoloff talked about any surveys of police officers that had happened about what their thoughts on discipline are. And Reverend Nikoloff, I know some of those exist. I also know, I remember in Baltimore in 2020, they tried to survey officers and they had such a low response rate that they couldn't get any data. So I will definitely look, we will find all that. And then maybe the biggest priority here is us front loading the hiring of data and policy staff to help specifically with this project. We may also have a student team that's able to help us with this starting in January too. So I think data is very clear next steps for the board on this, as well as what I'm hearing too is examples, another data points as in examples of other disciplinary matrices, discipline guidelines, consequence guidelines that the board can start looking at, processing, thinking about.
So that sounds like a good start, everyone. So it's 7:50, unless there's anything else. Nope, everybody looks like they're ready to go. So this was not a formal meeting. So everybody have a wonderful Thursday night, and we have some next steps to go through. So everybody will talk to you soon. Thank you so much for SMK for joining us tonight, and everybody have a great night.
Take care, people.
Night, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Good night.
All right, Rena, we can take it off live stream.
All
If
right.
anyone's still watching.